We feel perfectly confident in saying things like, Basil voted for the Tories because he liked Mrs. Thatcher's handling of the Falklands affair. But we have no idea how to go about saying things like, Basil voted for the Tories because of a condition of his hypothalamus. That is, we have common sense explanations of people's behavior in mental terms, in terms of their desires, wishes, fears, hopes, and so on. And we suppose that there must also be a neurophysiological sort of explanation of people's behavior in terms of processes in their brains. The trouble is that the first of these sorts of explanation works well enough in practice, but is not scientific, whereas the second is certainly scientific, but we have no idea how to make it work in practice. Now that leaves us apparently with a gap between the brain and the mind. And some of the greatest intellectual efforts of the 20th century have been attempts to fill this gap, to get a science of human behavior which was not just common sense grandmother psychology, but was not scientific neurophysiology either. Up to the present time, without exception, the gap-filling efforts have been failures. Behaviorism was the most spectacular failure, but in my lifetime I have lived through exaggerated claims made on behalf of, and eventually disappointed by, games theory, cybernetics, information theory, structuralism, sociobiology, and a bunch of others. To anticipate a bit, I'm going to claim that all the gap-filling efforts fail because there isn't any gap to fill. The most recent gap-filling efforts rely on analogies between human beings and digital computers. On the most extreme version of this view, which I call strong artificial intelligence, or just strong AI, the brain is a digital computer and the mind is just a computer program. Now that's the view I refuted last week. The latest attempt to fill the gap is often called cognitivism because it derives from work in cognitive psychology and artificial intelligence, and it forms the mainstream of a new discipline of cognitive science. Like strong AI, it sees the computer as the right picture of the mind and not just as a metaphor. But unlike strong AI, it does not, or at least it doesn't have to, claim that computers literally have thoughts and feelings. If one had to summarize the research program of cognitivism, it would look like this. Thinking is processing information, but information processing is just symbol manipulation. Computers do symbol manipulation, so the best way to study thinking, or as they prefer to call it, cognition, is to study computational symbol manipulating programs, whether they are in computers or in brains. On this view, then, the task of cognitive science is to characterize the brain not at the level of nerve cells, nor at the level of conscious mental states, but rather at the level of its functioning as an information processing system, and that's where the gap gets filled. Now, I really can't exaggerate the extent to which this research program has seemed to constitute a major breakthrough in the science of the mind. Indeed, according to its supporters, it might even be the breakthrough that will at last place psychology on a secure scientific footing now that it has freed itself from the delusions of behaviorism. I'm going to attack cognitivism in this lecture, but I want to begin by illustrating its attractiveness. We know that there is a level of naive, common-sense grandmother psychology and also a level of neurophysiology, a level of neurons and neuron modules and synapses and neurotransmitters and boutons and all the rest of it. So why would anyone suppose that between these two levels, there's also a level of mental processes which are computational processes? And indeed, why would anyone suppose that it's at that level that the brain performs those functions that we regard as essential to the survival of the organism, namely the functions of information processing? Well, there are several reasons. First of all, let me mention one which is somewhat disreputable, but I think it's actually quite influential. Because we don't understand the brain very well, we're constantly tempted to use the latest technology as a model for trying to understand it. In my childhood, we were always assured that the brain was a telephone switchboard. What else could it be? And I was amused to see that Sherrington, the great British neuroscientist, thought that the brain worked like a telegraph system. Freud often compared the brain to hydraulic and electromagnetic systems. Leibniz compared it to a mill, and now, obviously, the metaphor is the digital computer. And this, by the way, fits in with the general exaggerated guff that we hear nowadays about computers and robots. We're frequently assured by the popular press that we're on the verge of having household robots that will do all the housework, babysit our children, amuse us with lively conversation, and take care of us in our old age. This, of course, is so much nonsense. We're nowhere near being able to produce robots that can do any of these things. And indeed, successful robots have been confined to very restricted tasks in very limited contexts, such as automobile production lines. Well, let's get back to the serious reasons that people have for supposing that cognitivism is true. First of all, they suppose that they actually have some psychological evidence that it's true. I don't intend to say very much about this evidence because I think everyone would agree that it's quite inconclusive and subject to a lot of different interpretations. However, underlying the computational interpretation of the evidence is a deeper and I believe more influential reason for accepting cognitivism. The second reason goes like this. Because we can design computers that follow rules when they process information, and because apparently human beings also follow rules when they think, then there's some unitary sense in which the brain and the computer are functioning in a similar, and indeed maybe the same, fashion. The third assumption that lies behind the cognitive research program is an old one. It goes back as far as Leibniz and probably as far as Plato. It's the assumption that a mental achievement must have theoretical causes. It's the assumption that if the output of a system is meaningful, in the sense that, for example, our ability to learn a language or our ability to recognize faces is a meaningful cognitive ability, then there must be some theory internalized somehow in our brains that underlies this ability. Well, what shall we make of these arguments for cognitivism? I don't believe that I have a knockdown refutation of cognitivism in the way that I do believe I have one for strong AI. But I believe that if we examine the arguments that are given in favor of cognitivism, we will see that they are very weak indeed. And, in fact, an exposure of their weaknesses will enable us to understand several important differences between the way human beings behave and the way computers function. Let's start with the notion of rule following. We're told that human beings follow rules and that computers follow rules. But I want to argue that there's a crucial difference. In the case of human beings, whenever we follow a rule, we are being guided by the actual content or the meaning of the rule. In the case of human rule following, meanings cause behavior. Now, of course, they don't cause the behavior all by themselves, but they certainly play a causal role in the production of the behavior. So consider the rule, drive on the left-hand side of the road in Great Britain. Now, whenever I come to Britain, I have to remind myself of this rule. How does it work? To say that I'm obeying the rule is to say that the meaning of that rule, that is, its semantic content, plays some kind of causal role in the production of what I actually do. Notice that there are lots of other rules that would describe what's happening, but they're not the rules that I happen to be following. So, for example, assuming that I'm on a two-lane road and that the steering wheel is located on the right-hand side of the car, then you could say that my behavior is in accord with the rule, drive in such a way that the steering wheel is nearest to the center line of the road. Now, that is, in fact, a correct description of my behavior, but that's not the rule that I follow in Britain. The rule I follow is drive on the left-hand side of the road. I want to make this point completely clear, so let me give you another example. When my children went to the Oakland driving school, they were taught a rule for parking cars. The rule was, maneuver your car toward the curb with the steering wheel in the extreme right position until your front wheels are even with the rear wheels of the car in front of you. Then turn the steering wheel all the way to the extreme left position. Now notice that if they're following this rule, then its meaning must play a causal role in the production of their behavior. I was interested to learn this rule because it's not a rule that I follow. In fact, I don't follow a rule at all when I park a car. I just look at the curb and try to get as close to the curb as I can without bashing into the cars in front of and behind me. But notice, it might turn out that my behavior, viewed from outside, viewed externally, is identical with the behavior of the person who's following the rule. The formal properties of the behavior are not sufficient to show that a rule is being followed. In order that the rule be followed, the meaning of the rule has to play some causal role in the behavior. Now, the moral of this discussion for cognitivism can be put very simply. In the sense in which human beings follow rules, and incidentally, human beings follow rules a whole lot less than cognitivists claim they do, but in that sense, computers don't follow rules at all. They only act in accord with certain formal procedures. The program of the computer determines the various steps that the machinery will go through. It determines how one state will be transformed into a subsequent state. And we can speak metaphorically as if this were a matter of following rules. But in the literal sense in which human beings follow rules, computers do not follow rules. They only act as if they were following rules. Now, such metaphors are quite harmless. Indeed, they're both common and useful in science. We can speak metaphorically of any system as if it were following rules, the solar system, for example. The metaphor only becomes harmful if it's confused with the literal sense. It's okay to use a psychological metaphor to explain the computer. The confusion comes when you take the metaphor literally and then try to use the computer to explain the psychology. So we have two senses of rule following, a literal and a metaphorical, and it's very easy to confuse the two. Now, I want to apply the lessons of this example to the notion of information processing. I believe the notion of information processing embodies a similar, massive confusion. The idea is that since I process information when I think, and since my calculating machine processes information when it takes something as input, transforms it, and produces information as output, then there must be some unitary sense in which we are both processing information. But that seems to me obviously false. The sense in which I do information processing when I think is the sense in which I am consciously or unconsciously engaged in certain mental processes. But in that sense of information processing, the calculator doesn't do information processing since it doesn't have any mental processes at all. It simply mimics or simulates the formal features of the mental processes that I have. That is, even if the steps that the calculator goes through are formally the same as the steps that I go through, it wouldn't show that the machine does anything at all like what I do, for the very simple reason that the calculator has no mental phenomena. In adding 6 and 3, it doesn't know that the numeral 6 stands for the number 6, and that the numeral 3 stands for the number 3, and that the plus sign stands for the operation of addition. And that's for the very simple reason that it doesn't know anything. Indeed, that's why we have calculators. They can do calculations faster and more accurately than we can without having to go through any mental effort to do it. In the sense in which we have to go through information processing, they don't. We need then to make a distinction between two senses of the notion of information processing, or at least two radically different kinds of information processing. The first kind, which I will call psychological information processing, involves mental states. To put it at its crudest, when people perform mental operations, they actually think. And thinking characteristically involves processing information of one kind or another. But there's another sense of information processing in which there are no mental states at all. In these cases, there are processes which are as if there were some mental information processing going on. Let's call these second kinds of cases of information processing as if forms of information processing. It's perfectly harmless to use both of these two kinds of mental ascriptions, provided we do not confuse them. However, what we find in cognitivism is a persistent confusion of the two. Now, once we see this distinction clearly, we can see one of the most profound weaknesses in the cognitivist argument. From the fact that I do information processing when I think, and the fact that the computer does information processing, even information processing which may simulate the formal features of my thinking, it simply doesn't follow that there's anything psychologically relevant about the computer program. In order to show psychological relevance, there would have to be some independent argument that the as-if computational information processing is psychologically relevant. The notion of information processing is being used to mask this confusion because one expression is being used to cover two quite distinct phenomena. In short, the confusion that we found about rule following has an exact parallel in the notion of information processing. However, there's a deeper and more subtle confusion involved in this notion of information processing. Notice that in the as-if sense of information processing, any system whatever can be described as if it were doing information processing. And indeed, we might even use it for gathering information. So it isn't just a matter of using calculators and computers. Consider, for example, water running downhill. Now we can describe the water as if it were doing information processing, and we might even use it to get information. We might use it, for example, to get information about the line of least resistance in the contours of the hill. But it simply doesn't follow from that there's anything of any psychological relevance about water running downhill. There's no psychology at all to the action of gravity on water. But we can apply the lessons of this point to the study of the brain. It's an obvious fact that the brain has a level of real psychological information processes. To repeat, people actually think, and thinking goes on in their brain. Furthermore, there are all sorts of things going on in the brain at the neurophysiological level that actually cause our thought processes. But many people suppose that in addition to these two levels, the level of naive psychology and the level of neurophysiology, there must be some additional level of computational information processing. Now, why do they suppose that? I believe it's because they confuse the psychologically real level of information processing with the possibility of giving as-if information processing descriptions of the processes that are going on in the brain. So if you talk about water rolling downhill, everyone can see that it's psychologically irrelevant. But it's harder to see that exactly the same point applies to the brain. What is psychologically relevant about the brain are the facts that it contains psychological processes and that it has a neurophysiology that causes and realizes those processes. But the fact that we can then describe other processes in the brain from an as-if information processing point of view by itself provides no evidence that these are at all psychologically real or even psychologically relevant. Once we're talking about the inside of the brain, it's harder to see the confusion, but it's exactly the same confusion. The next assumption to examine is the idea that behind all meaningful behavior there must be some internal theory. One finds this assumption in many areas, and not just in cognitive psychology. So, for example, Chomsky's search for a universal grammar is based on the assumption that if there are certain features common to all languages, and if these features are constrained by common features of the human brain, then there must be an entire complex set of rules of universal grammar in the brain. But a much simpler hypothesis would be that the physiological structure of the brain constrains possible grammars without the intervention of an intermediate level of rules or theories. Not only is this hypothesis simpler, but also the very existence of universal features of language constrained by innate features of the brain suggests that the neurophysiological level of description is enough to do the job. You don't need to suppose that there are any rules on top of the neurophysiological structures. A couple of analogies I hope will make this clear. It's a simple fact about human vision that we can't see infrared or ultraviolet. Now, is that because we have a universal rule of visual grammar that says, don't see infrared or ultraviolet? No, it's obviously because our visual apparatus simply is not sensitive to these two ends of the spectrum. Or to take another example, If we try to do a theoretical analysis of the human ability to stay in balance while walking, it might look as if there were some more or less complex mental processes going on, as if taking in cues of various kinds, we solved a series of quadratic equations, unconsciously of course, and these enabled us to walk without falling over. But we actually know that this sort of mental theory is not necessary to account for the achievement of walking without falling over. In fact, it's done in a very large part by fluids in the inner ear that simply do no calculating at all. If you spin around enough so as to upset the fluids, you're likely to fall over. Now, I want to suggest that a great deal of our cognitive achievements may well be like that. The brain just does them. We have no good reason for supposing that in addition to the level of our mental states and the level of our neurophysiology, there is some unconscious calculating going on. Consider face recognition. We all recognize the faces of our friends, relatives, and acquaintances quite effortlessly, and indeed we now have evidence that certain portions of the brain are specialized for face recognition. How does it work? Well, suppose we were going to design a computer that could recognize faces as we do. It would carry out quite a computational task involving a lot of calculating of geometrical and topographical features. But is that any evidence that the way that we do it involves calculating and computing? Notice that when we step in wet sand and make a footprint, neither our feet nor the sand does any computing. But if we were going to design a program that would calculate the topology of a footprint from information about differential pressures on the sand, it would be a fairly complex computational task. The fact that a computational simulation of a natural phenomenon involves complex information processing does not show that the phenomenon itself involves such processing. And it may be that facial recognition is as simple and as automatic as making footprints in the sand. Indeed, if we pursue the computer analogy consistently, we find that there are a great many things going on in the computer that are not computational processes either. For example, in the case of some calculators, if you ask, how does the calculator multiply 7 times 3? The answer is, it adds 3 to itself 7 times. But if you then ask, and how does it add 3 to itself? There isn't any computational answer to that. It's just done in the hardware. So the answer to the question is, it just does it. And I want to suggest that for a great many absolutely fundamental abilities, such as our ability to see or our ability to learn a language, there may not be any theoretical mental level underlying those abilities. The brain just does them. We are neurophysiologically so constructed that the assault of photons on our photoreceptor cells enables us to see, and we are neurophysiologically so constructed that the stimulation of hearing other people talk and interacting with them will enable us to learn a language. Now, I'm not saying that rules play no role in our behavior. On the contrary, rules of language or rules of games, for example, seem to play a crucial role in the relevant behavior. But I am saying that it's a very tricky question to decide which parts of behavior are rule-governed and which are not. And we can't just assume that all meaningful behavior has some system of rules underlying it. I want to conclude this lecture on a more positive note by saying what the implications of this approach are for the study of the mind. As a way of countering the cognitivist picture, let me present an alternative approach to the solution of the problems besetting the social sciences. Let's abandon the idea that there is a computer program between the mind and the brain. Think of the mind and mental processes as biological phenomena which are as biologically based as growth or digestion or the secretion of bile. Think of our visual experiences, for example, as the end product of a series of events that begin with the assault of photons on the retina and end somewhere in the brain. Now, there will be 2 gross levels of description in the causal account of how vision takes place in animals. There will be first a level of the neurophysiology, a level at which we can discuss individual neurons, synapses, and action potentials. But within this neurophysiological level, there will be lower and higher levels of description. It isn't necessary to confine ourselves solely to neurons and synapses. We can talk about the behavior of groups or modules of neurons, such as the different levels of types of neurons in the retina or the columns in the cortex. And we can talk about the performance of the neurophysiological systems at much greater levels of complexity, such as the role of the striate cortex in vision, or the role of zones 18 and 19 in the visual cortex, or the relationship between the visual cortex and the rest of the brain in processing visual stimuli. So within the neurophysiological level, there will be a series of levels of description, all of them equally neurophysiological. Now, in addition to that, there will also be a mental level of description. We know, for example, that perception is a function of expectation. If you expect to see something, you will see it much more readily. We know, furthermore, that perception can be affected by various mental phenomena. We know that mood and emotion can affect how and what one perceives. And again, within this mental level, within this level of intentionality, there will be different levels of description. We can talk not only about how perception is affected by individual beliefs and desires, but also about how it is affected by such global mental phenomena as the person's background abilities or his general world outlook. But in addition to the level of the neurophysiology and the level of intentionality, we don't need to suppose there's another level, a level of digital computational processes. And there's no harm at all in thinking of both the level of mental states and the level of neurophysiology as information processing, provided we do not make the confusion of supposing that the real psychological information processing is the same as the as-if form of information processing. To conclude, then, where are we in our assessment of the cognitivist research program? Well, I have certainly not demonstrated that it's false. It might turn out to be true. I think its chances of success are about as great as the chances of success of behaviorism 50 years ago. That is to say, I think its chances of success are virtually nil. What I have done to argue for this, however, is simply the following three things. First, I have suggested that once you've laid bare the basic assumptions behind cognitivism, their implausibility is quite apparent. But these assumptions are, in large part, very deeply seated in our intellectual culture. Some of them are very hard to root out or even to become fully conscious of. My first claim is that once we fully understand the nature of the assumptions, their implausibility is manifest. The second point I've made is that we don't actually have sufficient empirical evidence for supposing that these assumptions are true, since the interpretation of the existing evidence rests on an ambiguity in certain crucial notions, such as the notion of information processing or rule following. And third, I've presented an alternative view, both in this lecture and the first lecture, of the relationship between the brain and the mind. A view that does not require us to postulate any intermediate level of algorithmic computational processes mediating between the neurophysiology of the brain and the intentionality of the mind. The feature of that picture which is important for this discussion is that in addition to a level of mental state, such as beliefs and desires, and a level of neurophysiology, there is no other level. No gap filler is needed between the mind and the brain because there's no gap to fill. The computer is probably no better and no worse as a metaphor for the brain than earlier mechanical metaphors. We learn as much about the brain by saying it's a computer as we do by saying it's a telephone switchboard, a telegraph system, a water pump, or a steam engine. My overall objective in these lectures is to try to answer some of the most puzzling questions about how human beings fit into the rest of the universe. In my first lecture, I tried to solve the mind-body problem. In the second, I disposed of some extreme claims that identify human beings with digital computers. In this one, I have raised some doubts about the cognitivist research program. I now want to turn my attention to explaining the structure of human actions, the nature of the social sciences, and the problem of the freedom of the will.